There is a sound that, once heard, is never forgotten. It is not the piercing scream of a diving fighter jet, but a deep, resonant thunder that seems to come not from one point in the sky, but from the entire sky. In 1945, for the inhabitants of Japan, this was the sound of the apocalypse, a sound that traveled ahead of destruction, announcing that the world as they knew it was about to be consumed by fire. This was the sound of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Imagine a machine so advanced, so lethal, and so imposing that even at thousands of meters above sea level, its simple blare could freeze the blood of those on the ground long before the first bomb fell. This is not just the story of an aircraft. It is the chronicle of a weapon that rewrote the rules of war. A symbol of American air power, born of necessity, forged in secrecy, and baptized in fire. Many know the B-17, the flying fortress that bled into oblivion in the skies over Europe. But the B-29 was something else entirely, an entity of a different order. It wasn't created to fight an existing war. It was designed to end one. The B-29 Superfortress didn't just win battles, it changed the course of history and launched us brutally and definitively into the atomic age. To understand this machine, we need to go back to a time when it was nothing more than an impossible dream, an engineering delusion on a piece of paper, a machine that, for all intents and purposes, shouldn't even exist. Late 1930s. While Hitler's Germany rearmed in open defiance of the world, the United States still lived under the veil of isolationism. The U.S. Army Air Force at the time was a shadow of its future self. Its main bombers, the B-17 and B-24, were designed for the European theater, relatively short flights, departing from bases in England. But some visionaries, like General Henry Hap Arnold, looked at the world map and saw a much larger problem: the Pacific Ocean, a vast theater of operations dotted with distant islands. If war came with Japan, how could the United States project its air power across thousands of miles of ocean? It was in this context that Boeing, in 1939, responded to an almost fictional requirement from the Army. They wanted a super bomber, an aircraft that could carry 900 kilograms of bombs over a range of over 8,500 kilometers with a speed of 640 kilometers per hour. These were absurd numbers for the technology of the time. Boeing's response was the Model 345. Initially, the project was viewed with skepticism. It was complex, expensive, and seemed like a solution looking for a problem. But then history took a violent turn. December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Overnight, the problem the B-29 was designed to solve became the United States' greatest national emergency. Forward bases in the Pacific, such as the Philippines, were lost. The need for a bomber with intercontinental range ceased to be a strategic luxury and became a matter of survival. The project, now renamed the XB-29, was given the green light and a blank check. The U.S. government poured more than $3 billion into it. To put this in perspective, the famous Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, cost around $2 billion. The B-29 was until that point the most expensive weapon in human history. It was the highest stakes of the war. To build it, America performed a logistical miracle. Colossal factories were erected from scratch in record time in the middle of nowhere. In Wichita, Kansas, Marietta, Georgia, and Omaha, Nebraska, city-sized industrial complexes rose from the dust. Thousands of workers, many of whom had never seen an airplane up close, were recruited to assemble one of the most complex machines ever conceived. Each B-29 contained more than 55,000 different parts, not counting rivets. But this race against time came at a cost. The project was so rushed and its technology so new that problems were constant. Engineers and test pilots nicknamed the prototype the Cursed Plane. And the curse turned to tragedy in February 1943 when the second prototype, B-29, caught fire in midair and crashed into a factory in Seattle, killing the entire Boeing test crew, including its legendary chief pilot, Edmund Allen. The project was almost canceled, but the need for war outweighed fear. The $3 billion gamble had to work. There was no plan B. What exactly made the B-29 so revolutionary and, at the same time, so dangerous? The answer lies in a series of innovations that placed it decades ahead of any other aircraft in the sky. Let's start with comfort, a word that sounds strange in the context of a bomber. B-17 crews in Europe faced the icy hell at 8,000 meters of altitude, temperatures of -50°C, thin oxygen, and the constant need for masks and heavy power suits that frequently failed, leading to fainting and frostbite. The B-29 changed this paradigm. It was the world's first mass-produced bomber with fully pressurized and air-conditioned cabins. The fuselage was, in practice, divided into 3 pressure compartments: the forward cockpit, the mid-fuselage gunner's compartment, and the tail gunner's station. A pressurized tunnel, just under a meter in diameter, ran above the 2 gigantic bomb bays, allowing the crew to move between the forward sections and intermediate during flight. For the first time, men could fly for 15 hours or more in a shirt-sleeved environment at a comfortable cabin altitude of 8,000 feet, while the plane flew at over 30,000 feet, well above most fighters and enemy anti-aircraft artillery. But the greatest innovation lay in its defense. Previous bombers were flying porcupines, with men in exposed glass turrets manually operating heavy machine guns in the freezing cold. The B-29 abolished this. It introduced a General Electric remote fire control system, 5 turrets containing a total of 10 to 12 50-caliber machine guns were remotely controlled by 5 gunners seated in comfortable gun points. Using computerized displays, a gunner could control multiple turrets simultaneously. The system automatically calculated wind speed, gravity, and the required deviation to hit a moving enemy fighter. It was a deadly video game, a technology straight out of scientific fiction. And for attack, the B-29 was an unparalleled precision platform. In addition to the famous Norden optical sight, which allowed for precision strikes on clear days, many B-29s were equipped with the AN/APQ-13 radar. This electronic eye allowed the bomber to target and attack through thick clouds or in total darkness, a capability that terrified the enemy. Add to this an advanced autopilot, long-range radio navigation equipment, and the ability to carry up to 9 tons of bombs. The result was a flying fortress that could go farther, fly higher, and strike with more power and precision than anything else on the planet. All this technological advancement was fueled by colossal power. 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone radial engines, each with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, generated 2,200 horsepower each. Together, the 4 engines gave the B-29 a combined 8,800 horsepower at takeoff. They were the most powerful aircraft power plants in the world. But with great power came hellish problems. The R3350 engines were the B-29's Achilles heel, especially in the early years. They had an alarming tendency to overheat. Pushed to the limits of their performance and encased in cramped nacelles to improve aerodynamics, the engines lacked sufficient cooling, especially during the slow, heavy climb after takeoff. Magnesium, used extensively in the engine crankcase to save weight, was highly flammable. A small oil or fuel leak onto an overheated engine could start a magnesium fire, which burned with such fierce intensity that it could melt the main wing spar in less than a minute. Many B-29s were lost not to the enemy, but to their own engines. Crews lived in a constant state of tension, their eyes glued to cylinder head temperature gauges. This brings us to the most overworked member of the 11-man crew, the flight engineer. While the two pilots handled the aircraft's steering, the flight engineer was the conductor of an incredibly complex mechanical orchestra. Sitting behind the pilots, he stared at a gigantic panel covered in hundreds of dials, switches, and levers. He monitored the health of each of the four engines, constantly adjusting the fuel mixture, propeller pitch, oil pressure, and coolant flaps. He managed the electrical system, the hydraulic system, the fuel system, and cabin pressurization. His pre-flight and takeoff checklist contained hundreds of items. A single miscalculation, a single overlooked reading could condemn everyone. It was one of the most demanding and responsible positions in all of military aviation. And at the electrical heart of the aircraft was a small but vital piece of equipment, an auxiliary power generator, affectionately nicknamed Putt-Putt by the crew. This small unit, essentially a lawnmower engine, provided power on the ground to power the systems and start the main engines. In flight, it was the emergency backup. If the main generators failed, the Putt-Putt was the last hope for keeping essential systems, such as the defense turrets, functioning. It was another cog in the complex war machine that was the B-29, a machine where the line between technological triumph and catastrophic failure was frighteningly thin.
When the B-29 finally took off in significant numbers toward Japan in mid-1944, it wasn't just a bombing mission. It was a harbinger of the apocalypse. The first missions, however, were a frustrating failure. Operating from bases in China in what was called Operation Matterhorn, the B-29s flew at extreme altitudes, above 30,000 feet to stay safe. But at that altitude, they encountered an invisible and unknown enemy, the jet stream. Hurricane-force winds, blowing at over 180 miles per hour, blew the bombs far from their targets. Precision, the aircraft's greatest asset, was nullified. The missions were long, dangerous, consumed immense amounts of fuel, which had to be flown to China over the Himalayas at exorbitant cost, and the results were negligible. The B-29 program was on the verge of being considered a $3 billion failure. It was then that a new commander arrived in the Pacific, General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was a pragmatic, ruthless, and results-driven man. He reviewed reports, analyzed data, and came to a radical conclusion that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. He realized that Japanese cities, with their high density of wood and paper buildings, were extremely vulnerable to fire. The high-altitude strategy of explosive bombs didn't work, so he reversed the doctrine. His new order shocked his crews. They would attack at night, singly, not in formation. They would fly low, at altitude between 1,500 and 3,000 meters to avoid the jet stream and enemy radar. And, most controversial of all, he ordered that most defensive armament and ammunition be removed to make way for a maximum load of incendiary bombs. His crews felt naked, flying low and slow over the heart of the enemy empire. LeMay gambled their careers and the lives of his men in a single, terrifying thesis. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945 was the acid test. 334 B-29s took off from the Mariana Islands, each loaded with tons of M69 cluster bombs, small devices designed to spread burning napalm. The target was Tokyo. The result was hell on earth. In a single night, the B-29s created a firestorm. a phenomenon in which the heat of the fire is so intense that it creates its own wind system, sucking everything into the center of the hurricane of flames. 41 square kilometers of central Tokyo were incinerated. The most conservative estimates put the death toll at 100,000 in just a few hours, more than the initial deaths at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the deadliest and most destructive air raid in human history. And it didn't stop there. The Tokyo mission became the model. In the following weeks, LeMay's B-29 force systematically applied Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities. The efficiency of the destruction was brutal. A single B-29 could now burn an area that would previously have required an entire fleet. Industrial Japan was being wiped off the map, city by city, night by night. The country was on its knees, but the military leadership refused to surrender. Something even more terrible was coming.
While LeMay's firebombing campaign devastated Japan, an even more secret project was unfolding in parallel. No other aircraft in history carried such symbolic and devastating weight as two specific B-29s, the Enola Gay and the Bockscar. They didn't just carry bombs, they carried the fate of millions and the dawn of a new era of global fear. These planes were part of Project Silverplate, a top-secret modification of a small number of B-29s. To carry the first nuclear weapons, which were huge and heavy, these planes were extensively modified. The armor was removed, the defensive turrets were removed, except for the tail, and the bomb bays were reconfigured with a new suspension and release system. They were superfortresses, optimized for a single mission. Training for this mission was conducted in absolute secrecy on the Pacific island of Tinian, then home to the world's largest airport. The 509th Composite Group, the unit in charge of the mission, lived and trained in an isolated area. Its crews tirelessly practiced long-distance flights, high-altitude bombing maneuvers, and an extremely steep escape turn designed to put the greatest possible distance between the plane and detonation in a matter of seconds. Not even the pilots knew, until the final moments, the true nature of the weapon they carried. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian. In its bomb bay was Little Boy, a uranium bomb. Its destination, Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was dropped. 43 seconds later, the world changed forever. The crew, miles away, saw a flash brighter than the sun and a mushroom cloud rising at terrifying speed. 3 days later, with the Japanese government still in shock and undecided, the second mission was launched. The B-29 Bockscar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, carrying Fat Man, a plutonium bomb. The primary target, Kokura, was shrouded in clouds. After several flybys, Sweeney diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. History repeated itself. The two attacks instantly killed between 129,000 and 226,000 people, the vast majority civilians, and sealed Japan's unconditional surrender days later. The moral and military debate over the decision to use these weapons began at that moment and continues to this day. On one side, the argument that the bombs saved lives, preventing a ground invasion of Japan that, according to estimates, would have cost millions of American and Japanese casualties. On the other, the horror of unleashing the power of mass annihilation on civilian populations. Regardless of perspective, the B-29 Superfortress secured its place in history as the herald of the atomic age. It was not just a weapons carrier, it became the very symbol of the absolute power of technology over human life. The end of World War II did not mean the end of the B-29. The superfortress that ended one global conflict found itself almost immediately at the beginning of another, the Cold War. During the Korean War in the early 1950s, the B-29 was once again the U.S. Air Force's primary strategic bomber, flying daylight bombing missions until the emergence of Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters made them too vulnerable. They then switched to night missions, continuing to attack North Korean supply lines and industrial targets. But the B-29's most fascinating Cold War legacy came from an unauthorized copy. In 1944, several B-29s damaged on missions over Japan made emergency landings in the Soviet Union. Since the Soviets were neutral in the Pacific War at the time, the crews were returned, but the planes were confiscated. On Stalin's orders, Soviet engineers were given a monumental task to disassemble and copy the B-29 piece by piece. The result was the Tupolev Tu-4, a near-perfect carbon copy that became the Soviet Union's first strategic bomber capable of striking the United States with a nuclear weapon. The B-29 not only gave the United States air supremacy, it inadvertently kick-started its greatest adversary's strategic bomber program. In the United States, the B-29 design evolved. The B-50 Superfortress emerged, essentially a B-29 with much more powerful and reliable engines and a reinforced airframe. Reconnaissance variants, such as the RB-29, flew dangerous espionage missions along the Soviet Union's borders. Tanker aircraft, the KB-29, pioneered large-scale aerial refueling. The B-29's architecture and design concepts directly influenced the development of America's first long-range jet bomber, the B-47 Stratojet, and ultimately its most famous and enduring successor, the B-52 Superfortress, a machine whose DNA traces directly back to the World War II Superfortress. Today, of the vast armada of nearly 4,000 B-29s built, only 2 remain airworthy. Their names are Fifi and Duck. Maintained by dedicated volunteers and funded by donations, they fly in air shows across America. They are living museums, noisy and imposing relics of a bygone era, when their 4 R-3350 engines roar to life with a cloud of smoke and a ground-shaking roar. They are not just airplanes. They are a living reminder of the power, innovation, and terrible responsibility that come with military technology. The B-29 Superfortress was not only the most advanced bomber of World War II, it heralded the modern era of warfare, an era in which conflict ceased to be measured solely in ground battles and became a matter of technological supremacy in the skies. An era in which a nation's destructive capacity could be delivered anywhere on the globe in a matter of hours. It was a machine of dualities. Its pressurized cabin saved crews from the torment of the cold, while its bombs plunged entire cities into a fiery inferno. Its technological precision was used to inflict the most indiscriminate destruction ever seen. It was the tool that, while saving countless American lives by forcing the end of the war, did so at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Japanese lives, forever changing the concept of mass destruction. The story of the B-29 is a mirror, a reflection of our own genius and our capacity for brutality. What if a single aircraft, conceived over 80 years ago, could change the course of humanity so profoundly? Profound. What lesson does this teach us about the power of the technology we develop today? What lesson does it teach us about the paths we choose to follow in times of conflict? If you thought the B-17 was the true flying fortress, now you know why the B-29 was a titan in a completely different category. If you enjoyed this historical immersion and want to see more machines, strategies, and stories that change the course of war, subscribe to the channel now and turn on the notification bell, because the next mission is already being prepared. Until next time.